All right, welcome back to Critical Weight Theory. And I haven't done a movie review since the 12th of May, so it's been a little while. Back then, I reviewed the movie Elephant, which is a politically charged movie in its own way. So it's been over 20 days since I've done this, and that's despite making a New Year's resolution to do more movie and TV show episode reviews. So, what a slacker I've been. So I'm glad to get back into this a little bit more. And today we're exploring V for Vendetta, which is a movie that I went a long time without checking out. And I'm glad that I can say that I finally watched it. It's a 2005 dystopian political thriller directed by James McTeigue and written by Lana and Lilly Wachowski, based on the influential graphic novel created by Alan Moore and artist David Lloyd. The film has evolved from a successful comic book adaptation into one of the most politically significant movies of the 21st century. Not bad for an action movie. And its imagery, dialogue, and themes continue to resonate in discussions about freedom, surveillance, protest movements, and the relationship between governments and the people they govern. I almost slipped up there and said serve, but of course, you all know that government is not just about serving the people, it's about serving the ruling class. Ooh, it's a controversial talking point, I know, but it's just been revealed to be absolutely true in this day and age. I think most people know that by now, unless they've just been like the stereotypical ostrich with the head in the sand. I think it's something that's just abundantly clear, painfully obvious, even. And it's a movie that went from a graphic novel to film. It's one of those. Like I said, it came out in 2005. V for Vendetta stars Natalie Portman as Evie Hammond and Hugo Weaving as V, a mysterious masked revolutionary operating in a future authoritarian Britain. And the supporting cast includes people like Stephen Ray, John Hurt, and Stephen Fry. And the film was actually James McTeague's directorial debut. So think about that. Imagine having a movie like this, which has been obviously influential, as your first film. Many viewers notice stylistic similarities to the Wachowskis' earlier work on The Matrix, but personally, I would say that this movie is significantly different in a lot of key ways. And you've got the combination of stylized action, philosophical themes, and political commentary that really distinguish the film from many comic book adaptations of its era. In fact, V is probably the most politically charged action hero in pop culture. And if you can think of somebody who is better described that way, go ahead and let me know. But it seems like V is definitely one of the most overtly political figures in an action movie. That is, it in my mind anyway. And I've definitely seen a fair amount of action movies. Interestingly, Alan Moore publicly distanced himself from this adaptation, and that might at first seem like it's a specific critique of this film, but he's actually done that with other adaptations. So I think some people, they might not understand why he did that, but he just feels like his characters, the way they were depicted in the graphic novels or the comic books or whatever you want to call them, he feels that they can't be successfully conveyed in the film format. So, I mean, you could debate him on that, but in any case, we still were able to get movies out of his material. And although the movie drew heavily from the graphic novel's premise and the characters, Moore objected to changes made to the story and requested that his name not be associated with the film. But again, that's something he's done with, a bunch of other things that he was associated with. So, what is the story here? Well, the film takes place in a near future United Kingdom ruled by the Norse Fire regime, which is a fascist government that maintains power through fear, surveillance, propaganda, censorship, and political repression. The story begins with Evie Hammond, an ordinary citizen, and she is rescued from secret police by a mysterious masked figure known only as V. Wearing the face of the historical figure Guy Fawkes, V launches a campaign against the regime. His targets are not particularly random, they seem to be pretty well plotted out. They are individuals and institutions connected to the government's rise and its crimes against the population. As the story unfolds, Evie is drawn deeper into V's mission. What begins as a chance encounter gradually transforms her understanding of freedom, fear, and resistance. And the narrative builds toward V's ultimate goal, the destruction of the House of Parliament on November 5th, invoking the memory of the failed gunpowder plot of, there's a famous rhyme, remember, remember the 5th of November. And I don't really know all the details of that particular uh, that campaign, the gunpowder plot of 1605. But I I don't think that's particularly relevant here. The point is this is a revolutionary figure who draws inspiration from some past event. And throughout the film, that phrase becomes, it becomes a bit of a catchphrase of the movie. It's like a symbol of resistance against authoritarian power. And there are plenty of themes of power and control throughout the movie. One reason V for Vendetta remains relevant is its exploration of political and philosophical themes that continue to shape public debate. The film examines fascism and authoritarian government, state surveillance, propaganda and media manipulation, civil liberties versus security, revolutionary violence, identity and anonymity, and that actually is a key part of uh, not only this movie but the reaction to the movie, part of the legacy of V for Vendetta. You've also got the theme of fear as a political tool and the general power of symbols and ideas. And perhaps the film's most quoted line summarizes its central argument. People should not be afraid of their governments, governments should be afraid of their people. That's something that you hear in the movie, at least once, maybe a couple times. And whether viewers agree with V's methods or not, it's actually a little bit controversial due to some of the things that he does. But whether you agree with them or not, the film consistently asks difficult questions about political legitimacy, obedience, and resistance, and all that kind of fun stuff. And the film did have a link to these questions involving post September 11th politics and the so called war on terror. That's another reason this movie has sort of lingered in people's minds, because there have always been concrete historical events or current events at a given time that make a movie like this seem like, hey, they could just as well be describing what's happening today. So, although based on a comic written during the 1980s, the film arrived in a very different political climate. The years following the September 11 attacks saw intense debates about national security, expanded surveillance powers, counterterrorism policies, and the balance between freedom and safety. And many audiences interpreted V for Vendetta as a commentary on those issues, in addition to, just a kind of an action flick sort of thing. And the fictional Norse Fire regime uses fear of terrorism and disease to justify extraordinary state power. So, critics and supporters alike recognized parallels to contemporary discussions occurring in Western democracies during the early years of the War on Terror, and the result was a film that felt unusually timely despite being adapted from material that was already decades old. And of course, you can't talk about this movie without discussing the mask that essentially escaped the movie. That mask in the movie is bigger than the movie itself. Few films have produced an image as culturally influential as the Guy Fawkes mask. And what began as a costume worn by a fictional revolutionary became a real world political symbol adopted by activists across the globe. And that's one of the reasons it's mind blowing. I actually didn't see this movie sooner because it was obviously a movie with symbols that carried over into the real world. You would see broadcasts about Anonymous, the activist organization, the hacker organization, and Anonymous would often, well, I mean, they would always have the Guy Fawkes mask. Why did I say often? They would always have that on. And that should have prompted me to say, well, okay, I should watch this movie now to see what all the fuss is about. The mask appeared at demonstrations organized by the decentralized activist collective called Anonymous, as I just mentioned, and it was also seen during protests associated with the Occupy Wall Street movement and numerous anti authoritarian demonstrations worldwide. And to be honest, I don't see it as often these days as as the masks used to be. Um, I don't know if there's a real effort to bring them back either. But man, for quite a while, they were really a very prominent part of sort of burgeoning underground politics. And the mask's popularity, it shows you that fictional symbols can acquire lives of their own. A piece of popular culture became a globally recognized icon of protest and dissent. And, I got to say, there's also an irony here because while protesters often wore the mask as a challenge to political and economic power, licensed versions generated royalties connected to the film's corporate owners. So, I mean, I guess you could get into that sort of thing too with a band like Rage Against the Machine, because obviously they generated profits for the record industry, which has links to powerful corporate media conglomerates in general. And you could say there's a bit of either hypocrisy, or you could say just awkward contradictions involved in this kind of stuff. But it's also a little bit like, you know, finger wagging at somebody because they have a job, yet they also criticize, the corporate world. Like, well, of course most people are going to have jobs. I mean, you got to make money in this kind of society that we've got. So I mean, there are always going to be these kind of contradictions and complications. And you know for some people you're just never going to be radical enough, and you're going to be exposed as a hypocrite or a sellout or whatever. So that's something that's plagued any of these types of organizations for, well, a long time. Anyway, though, it is a reminder that protest and commerce often exist in complicated relationships with one another. So, of course, you've also got uh, a lot of examples of people who come from privileged backgrounds who they might be criticized for having that sort of background. Like, um, you know, you're just a rich kid wanting to act like you're a revolutionary or something. But if you look at some of history's examples, like some of the biggest revolutionary figures and the most radical ones actually came from a position of relative privilege. Like my famous, or not my famous one, my favorite example of this is Kropotkin, who was born a Russian prince, and he kind of subverted that a little bit by becoming a revolutionary anarchist. So, he was a class traitor in some key respects, and he got in a little bit of trouble over that as well. So, it's to me not the best critique, given that sometimes you gotta accept the fact that there will be some class traitors in your movement if you are a member of such a movement. And you could almost see it as a badge of pride, actually. That might be a healthier way of looking at it. Of course, there's also a danger that one of those people is still linked to the establishment, and they're just trying to infiltrate it as like a spy and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, if you're a rebel, I guess you also have those types of concerns. But anyway, moving back to the movie itself, I got a little bit sidetracked. But the graphic novel is a little bit different from the film, which I'm sure also leads to some critiques. So the original graphic novel emerged during the political atmosphere of Britain under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Moore's work was deeply influenced by anarchist political thought. In the comic, V is more explicitly an anarchist, seeking not merely to replace one government with another, but to dismantle systems of domination altogether. So, the film retains some of those ideas, but shifts the emphasis quite a bit. So rather than focusing primarily on anarchism, the adaptation presents a broader critique of tyranny and a stronger defense of liberal democratic freedoms. And this made the story more accessible to mainstream audiences, but some fans argued that it softened the graphic novel's more radical political message. And, that's a little bit tough of a debate to have, because we're talking about a pretty mainstream movie here. How radical were you expecting it to actually be? You know what I mean? So that debate continues today and remains one of the most interesting aspects of comparing the two versions of the character. And the performances in the movie are another sort of underestimated part of the appeal. You've got one of the film's greatest achievements in Hugo Weaving's performance as V. Because the character's face is never shown, Weaving had to communicate emotion through voice, body language, timing, and dialogue alone. Despite the fixed mask, audiences can clearly sense V's anger, humor, sadness, and determination. It really is a stellar performance, in my opinion. Even though, like, the story does have a few weak points, it's got a few of the action movie cliches that might turn people off, and all that kind of stuff. I think the performances and the messaging of the movie are both pretty strong and compelling. And Natalie Portman also, she received considerable praise for her portrayal of Evie, and her character does go on. She has a sort of dramatic transformation of her own. She starts off as a frightened citizen and becomes someone more willing to confront fear and challenge authority. But I think the winner here is Hugo Weaving, because he really does a great job bringing the character to life. And there's a real visual style to the movie and memorable moments and quotable lines. You've got dystopian science fiction, a political thriller, uh, noir inspired imagery thing going on, and stylized action that has the comic book aesthetics in mind. So it does have the graphic novel type of vibe to it a little bit, even though it's a movie. And it does come across as gimmicky because it is an action flick, And it doesn't seem entirely plausible that somebody could do all of this stuff. And especially, there's a moment where it's like a dramatic death occurs. I'll just put it like that. It's like how long would he be able to survive this hail of bullets? Actually, I mean, to be honest, so there's a little bit of suspension of disbelief that I think is required for you to fully enjoy this movie. And there are memorable moments like V's explosive introduction and his hijacking of a government television broadcast, which seems to really tie into the organization Anonymous and, the hacktivist scene altogether. And there's a famous alliterative monologue beginning with voila, in view a humble vaudevillian veteran. And he just says a whole bunch of words that start with the letter V. It's a pretty funny moment actually, and I'm sure there are some people who have memorized that because they would be such nerds about it. But for me, I'm not. I've never been that great at memorizing stuff. I'm not a human jukebox when it comes to playing guitar. Like I suck at memorizing songs and song lyrics and stuff like that. So I'll leave that one up to the nerds to fully recite that one. But you've also got a final march on Parliament moment here, where thousands of citizens wear Guy Fawkes masks, and real life parallels because real life does have feats of bravery like that, and trying to restore sanity and fairness and justice and whatnot in the face of overt tyranny and oppression and violence and all that kind of stuff. So it's a political thriller and a work filled with memorable and iconic visuals. And when it was first released, uh, people were divided about it, just like they are now. But over time, the film's reputation grew considerably. Many viewers now see it as increasingly relevant in an age defined by digital surveillance, expanding state power, misinformation and disinformation, and political polarization. So today, V for Vendetta is frequently discussed alongside these major dystopian works like 1984, Brave New World, Brazil, and Children of Men. And its influence extends well beyond cinema. The film helped demonstrate that popular culture can shape political language, symbolism, and activism. There probably are some people who decided to become activists because they saw this movie. Like it's not something that a lot of people would consider as a topic, but it would be an interesting topic. Like, how many people actually were inspired by movies like this, or maybe songs, like when it comes to politically charged songs? And we often hear that music and movies don't change the world, but I think they do a little bit. I think they get the ball rolling a little bit sometimes. And contemporary political movements increasingly operate under the banners of popular culture, so V for Vendetta is definitely one of the clearest examples of that phenomenon. And nearly 2 decades after its release, V for Vendetta remains more than an action movie or a comic book adaptation. It's got a life of its own, really. It's a story about fear and courage, conformity and resistance, and authority and freedom. So whether viewers see V as a hero, a terrorist, a dumbass anarchist, or something more complicated, the film continues to provoke discussion about the nature of power and the responsibilities of citizenship. And its greatest message may be that ideas can outlive institutions, governments, and even individuals. As V himself reminds us, beneath this mask there is more than flesh. Beneath this mask there is an idea.